Election of Democrats ever in Salem. In this house, I never get the last word, so I'm going to concede early and pass to my wife, who's the chair of the Salem Democrats, Janet.
So welcome, everybody. You can tell as you look behind me, this is the reason why we bought this house. Because as some of you know, we lived in Saudi Arabia for almost 5 years, and it was a tense situation. Jim was ambassador, and before that, he had been in the military in flying out of Dahran Air Base. And that's a tense situation. And what I've always loved about New Hampshire, two things. One is this lake and how calm it is, and the other thing is the amazing privilege we have in living in this state, that we get to meet the most outstanding leaders who come to my house and share their ideas. And I think you would all agree with me that we're in such an important time in our history that we need strong, good, and clear thinking leadership. So without any other, I'd say one more thing. My very first boss in politics was the senator from Texas. And it was Lloyd Benson at the time. And he was a very professional man, and I learned so much from him. And one of the things I learned is Texas produces leaders. So, our next leader.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and Janet and Jim for hosting us and bringing all of us together in this incredibly beautiful place right now. With amazing people engaged in our democracy at perhaps one of the most defining moments of truth in this country's history. So nowhere else I'd rather be, no other folks I'd rather spend this evening with. And for the first time outside of Texas, I am joined by my wife, Amy, who's here with us as well. So I want to introduce you all to her. I'm going to be making the introductions. She's going to be answering the questions. So think of some good ones. Thank you all for taking some time to be with us and to welcome us. We're glad to be back in New Hampshire. Grateful to have the chance to introduce myself to those who I've not yet had the opportunity to meet, to answer your questions, to hear what's on your mind, to be guided by your experiences and your expertise as we come up against the greatest challenges that we have ever faced as a country. I was thinking about one in particular, and I'll tell you maybe from a personal perspective that you all may understand, especially the parents of younger kids. Amy and I have 3 kiddos. Ulysses is 12, Molly is 10, Henry is 8 years old. And this time last year, Henry had just come home from first grade at Vilas Elementary, this wonderful dual language public school where everything he learned in both languages. Loved the teachers there, the support staff. It was a short walk from our house, and perhaps the best part of every single day that we had was walking him to school. And just the conversations, him telling us about the dreams he had the night before, looking at this one tree that we would pass each day, where we kind of like talk about the change of the seasons and, you know, just the things that a first grader's talking about. Well, he comes home from school one day last year, and we asked him what he had done, and he talks about his teacher huddling Henry and his classmates into a closet to prepare for what so many now think is the inevitable, that at some point a shooter is going to come into that classroom, and they had better be prepared and know how to act when it happens. This is just life today. And for Henry, it was not shocking or out of the ordinary. It's just, I'm in first grade, and what you do is you get ready for a gunman to come into the classroom at some point. We were reading about an advisory sent to members of a PTA in another community. Those parents were instructed to tell their kids when a shooter comes into their classroom to make noise, to throw stuff in the air, to dance around. And one of the parents asked, well, what good is that going to do for these kids against a gunman? And the response was, it'll buy some precious seconds for some of those kids perhaps to get out of the classroom. Last year, almost to the day, there was a horrific shooting at a high school in Santa Fe, Texas. And in the wake of those murders, in the hours after that, a television reporter asks one of the students, were you shocked? Were you surprised? Could you believe that this happened? And she said, oh yeah, I expected this would occur sooner or later. And so that was on my mind when we learned the other day about Kendrick Castillo. In a community just outside of Denver, gunmen walk into his school, start shooting. He runs to the shooter, and in the process ends up saving the lives of his fellow students. And what I wondered is, in the way that Henry is now being prepared for what we think might be inevitable, in the way that that young woman in Santa Fe High School expected it would happen sooner or later, did Mr. Castillo just assume that this was going to happen? And did he have in the back of his mind, if a shooter comes in, this is what I'm going to do? Was that going through Riley Howell's mind in Charlotte at UNC Charlotte, when he, again, didn't run from but ran towards the gunfire? What is in our minds right now that we accept this level of bloodshed in our country? That more than 30,000 of our fellow Americans will lose their lives through gun violence in this and every single year until we change course. That it's kids in schools, it's worshipers in a synagogue, it's people in every walk of life, in every part of life, in public life, at concerts, happening 1 or 2 or 3 at a time every day, so numbingly common that too many of them do not even make the headlines or the nightly news, because it just happens in America. And somehow we have accepted that this is our fate and our fortune and our lot in life, that perhaps we've internalized that we are a violent people, or immoral, or evil. Or, for those of you who have been working on this issue, and Amy and I have been so inspired by the moms who demand action, by the students who've led the walkouts and the marches for our lives, which we followed in El Paso, Texas, that maybe this is not something that we have to accept. It's not an act of God or a force of nature. This is caused by our fellow humans, and there is a human solution to it. We have learned, thanks to moms, that those states that have adopted universal background checks have closed all the loopholes, the Charleston loophole, the boyfriend loophole, the gun seller, gun show loophole. They've seen a near 50% reduction in gun violence in those states. When we think about the fact that there are companies that have designed and engineered and sold to the United States military weapons of war that are really effective, very efficient at killing a lot of people very quickly and in great numbers, and that we're selling them into our communities with no added value for hunting or self-defense or sport, and then are somehow surprised when they end up doing the things that we read about or see on TV seemingly all the time, every single day. We understand that there's a human solution to that as well. Though it would require us standing up to the NRA and the gun lobby and the political action committees, and maybe affect the prospects in our next election and our ability to stay in power, if we thought not about the next poll, but about the next generation, about our kids, we would stop selling those into our communities as well. Leave them on the battlefield where they belong, where they're really good at killing people, and keep them out of our communities. If we looked at those communities that have adopted red flag laws, when you're exhibiting a tendency to harm yourself or to harm someone else in your life or someone in my life, let's make sure that you no longer have access to that firearm before you do harm to yourself or someone else. We could choose to do that as well. All that we lack is the political will, at least represented in those in our institutions of power, in Congress, in the White House, to do the right thing. What we do not lack, and what I am so inspired by as we travel the country, are young people, are older people who are standing up and telling us that they're just not going to take it anymore. They're a reminder to the United States that every moment of significant change has been brought about not by those in positions of public trust or power. We're grateful to Lyndon Baines Johnson for signing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, but this country forced him and those members of Congress who voted for it to do the right thing. Those who integrated the lunch counters knowing that they would be spat upon and punched and dragged off into jail. The Freedom Riders in the Deep South, those who joined John Lewis crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, those who lost their lives in the process, purchased greater civil rights, not just for them, or those who looked like they did, but for all of us, and forced those in power to make the change. Marriage equality didn't happen because of enlightened legislators. It happened because of people like us who stood up at gatherings like these and forced the conversation and the issue and the change. When it comes to gun violence and gun safety legislation, that's the only way that this is going to move forward. It's the only way it's going to move forward on healthcare. Our legislators for too long have accepted that tens of millions of our fellow Americans cannot see a doctor, can't take their children to a therapist to be well enough the next day before school. We accept that in 2019, in the wealthiest, the most powerful country on the face of the planet, people are dying of diabetes, of curable cancers, of the flu. We do not lack for resources. We do not want for medical technology or innovation. All that we lack is the ability to bridge our differences, the divides before us, and come together and do the right thing. In my home state of Texas, the largest inpatient mental health care provider is the Harris County Jail. The largest provider of mental health care services, the county jail system. I was telling that story here in New Hampshire, and a therapist told me that he was just treating a patient who threw a chair through a window at the restaurant he was eating in to get arrested on purpose, to go to the one place that he's guaranteed the care that he needs to make life at least temporarily bearable. And when we lock him up or her up, we're locking up their potential. Everything that they were placed on this planet to do in the first place is squandered and lost to us. And it costs us between 90 to 110 bucks a night to keep them locked up and fed and clothed and prescribed the psychotropic medications that temporarily make life bearable. Getting to guaranteed, high quality, universal health care for every child and man and woman in this country is eminently possible if we just decide that we are going to do it. Come together, defy the differences, and make it happen. Immigration, 1 million young people living under the fear of deportation back to a country they do not know, whose language they may no longer speak, where if they are successful against those long odds, they'll be successful for that place, not Salem, not New Hampshire, not El Paso, not Texas, not the United States of America. It has been 30 years since there's been any meaningful immigration reform in this country. We have people serving in modern day bondage. The leverage of their immigration status used against them in some of the toughest, most back-breaking work that we can find in this country. And we can liberate them to contribute to their full potential, to this country's continued greatness and success if we just decide we're gonna do it. Make those dreamers US citizens here in their home country. Do it not at the price of deporting their parents or their siblings or the millions more who are already adding far more than they will ever take. Don't lock up kids in cages and deport their moms back to Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, the deadliest countries on the face of the planet today. Decide that this is not a value of the Democratic Party or of people who live in communities like this one, that despite those differences of geography or party or race or religion or sexual orientation or how many generations you can count yourself an American, or whether you just got here this morning, before we are anything else, we are Americans first, and we are up to these challenges. Because those that we face right now will define us forever in how we meet them. And Amy and I very much fear the judgment of Ulysses and Molly and Henry when they're a little bit older, looking back on 2019 and this moment, everything that we faced, everything that we knew, everything that we understood was possible for this country, how did we acquit ourselves? Or were we found wanting? Because the greatest challenge of them all is before us now. Beyond the shadow of a doubt, this planet has cooked 1 degree Celsius just since 1980. Warmed not by God nor by Mother Nature, but by you and by me. Our emissions, our excesses, our inaction in the face of the facts and the truth and the science. I just left Iowa, and along the banks of the Missouri, you have entire communities that were submerged underwater. Places like Pacific Junction, which has never flooded in the history of Pacific Junction. Every single home was underwater. Everything of value within those homes lost to the owners forever. We toured a house that was built in 1908. They will not be able to save it or rebuild it. It and its history is gone. There were 4 times the runoff into the Missouri River Basin this year from a normal year. The greatest runoff since we've been keeping records on the Missouri River. And as I was touring that home in Pacific Junction in Davenport, the other side of the state, up against the Mississippi, saw the highest floodwaters in its history, breaking the record set in 1993. Houston, Texas, in my home state, 58 inches of rain in just one storm. That is the landfall record for a single event since we've been keeping them in all of North America. And it happened in 2017, and it was the third 500-year flood in just 5 years. The people of Houston should be good for another 1,500 years at this rate. But we know that they're not, because these storms, these floods, the historic wildfires that we saw in California, the droughts through which our farmers in Texas attempt to persist, to grow the food and the fiber that feeds and clothes not just this country, but the world, are going to become exponentially worse going forward. There were 400,000 apprehensions at our border with Mexico last year. As you know, many of them were kids who, if they were lucky, showed up with their parents. But increasingly, we are finding that those who are arriving are farmers from Honduras who are trying to plant what used to grow but does not any longer, because they too are in historic droughts and cannot feed themselves. If you think 400,000 is bad, wait until some countries in the Western Hemisphere can no longer support human life, because that's the direction that we're headed. But those scientists who tell us all of this say that there is an answer. Again, if we can defy the differences in this very divided, highly polarized country and come together, this is what is possible over the next decade. Fully transition off of fossil fuels, embrace fully renewable energy, invest in the next generation of them. The technologies that will drive this world will be invented by a country on this planet. I'd much rather it be the United States than be China. Put farmers in the driver's seat, pay them through the Farm Bill, allow them to make a profit doing the public good of planting cover crops to pull more of the carbon out of the air, inject it in the soil, allow them to use new technologies like precision tilling or no-till farming to disturb less of the carbon that's there, pay them to conserve their lands. And I just left Iowa, where every inch of every acre is under cultivation for soybeans and corn, because that's what we pay farmers to do right now. Pay them to keep that land in conservation easements. It's better for the soil, the air, the water, this planet if we do that now. And over the next 10 years, invest $5 trillion in the resiliency of our communities, those on the first line, so often lower income and communities of color. Make sure that those who've been left behind before are put first as this economy transitions, in much the same way that in the face of the existential threat in the 1930s and 40s to our Western democracies, this country emerged from the Great Depression, marshaled the greatest force the planet had ever seen, and made this world safe for democracy for the next 80 years. We can make sure that at this time of the most divided economy between those who have wealth and those who have none, that we give people the opportunity to join these high-skill, high-wage, high-paying jobs that will allow us to define this transition for this country and for the world. And if we do that, and take our rightful role once again as the indispensable nation, convene the other powers of the planet to do their part, then maybe we can keep this planet from warming a total of 2 degrees Celsius, after which it becomes so much harder for Ulysses and Molly and Henry and your kids and grandkids to make it in the places that we call home today. In order to do this, we're going to have to make this country work like she's never worked before. This democracy, where so many feel, justifiably so, that our institutions have been captured and corrupted by the highest bidders willing to pay for access and increasingly outcomes in our elections and our legislation must be freed of those influences in campaigns like ours that accept not a dime of political action committee money, no corporate help, no special interest contributions. All people, all the time, from every single part of this country, and perhaps owing in part to some of the help that we received here in New Hampshire for our campaign in Texas, try to replicate some of what we learned in that state. Running against Ted Cruz, coming up a little bit short in the process, 2.6% for those who were counting, and we were counting that night. We got to be part of something absolutely transformational. Our state before that night was 50th in voter turnout. Not because we love our democracy less than you do here in New Hampshire, but we were drawn that way by our state legislature based on your race, your ethnicity, your country of national origin. You were drawn out of your congressional district to diminish the power of your vote and make it less likely that we would hear the power of your voice. Our state, written off as so reliably red, where Democrats feared to tread and so Republicans didn't have to show up, was ready for people to be able to take on the responsibility of standing up to be counted. We went to every single one of the 254 counties of Texas, the bluest places on the planet. I met a friend from Austin, Texas in the back earlier. Thank you for being here. But also, some of the reddest places that you will find anywhere in the United States. King County voted for Donald Trump 96% in 2016. But I hope you agree with me, they're every bit as deserving of being heard, of being listened to, of being fought for, of being served. So we showed up in King County to find out what was on their minds, and we learned from them. And though we did not win, we helped 2 Democrats in a year for record turnout win seats previously held by Republicans, helping to flip the House of Representatives. We changed the composition of the state legislature, got behind 17 African-American women who won their races for judicial positions in Harris County, won independence for the first time in 10 years, and 500,000 Republicans who voted for Governor Greg Abbott, a Tea Party, Trump-loving, very conservative Republican at the top of the ballot, also voted with us. We never had to trim our sails or show up with anything less than the courage of our convictions. It shows that we can bridge these gaps and these divides and come together. And the kicker, for me at least, is that my mom, a lifelong Republican, also voted for us on election night in 2018. So we got her. I think that's what it's going to take. And that's why we have held, over the last 7 weeks, more than 140 town hall meetings like these, answered more than 700 questions, gone to red places, to blue places, to rural places, to big cities as well. Everyone counts, and we're running this race for everyone. And I'm here to tell you, if you give me the chance and your support, I will do everything within my power, not only to defeat Donald Trump November of 2020, as important as that is, but to help bring this country together so that in January of 2021, we can get after these big priorities that are in front of us and make this country proud. Thank you all for having us out. Jim and Janet, thank you very much. There you go. Amy would now like to answer your questions. Cynthia's got a microphone and she'll bring it to you if you raise your hand. Amy, you want to come over just in case someone does?
I'll just say very quickly that one of the most amazing parts of our race in the Senate, for the Senate, was traveling the state and meeting the most incredible people from everywhere who dedicated themselves fully to help. And so I've been in El Paso for the last 6 weeks, and I have been chomping at the bit to get out here and join Beto so that I could meet everyone who is stepping up at this incredibly important time. So really looking forward to getting a chance to say hello, shake your hand, look you in the eye, and thanks for being here.
Yeah.
That are in the tech sector. first I just wanted to thank Amy because she's tough. And I'm just really grateful to her that she's, supported you and your family and is like going through this with you because it's not easy. And I'm grateful to her. And I think a lot of people are not going to see what she's going through. So
Thank you for saying that.
so thank you. I wanted to hear what you had to say about cap and trade. If you're going to support cap and trade and advance nuclear in the United States to combat climate change.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Talked about climate and just how important facing that challenge is now. A friend of mine likened it to there being a shot clock. We know how much time is left, and it is counting down right now. Every single second is precious. First day of our administration, not only do we need to re-sign Paris, not only do we need to enforce Kigali, which was the agreement we signed in Rwanda, which said that we were going to bring hydrofluorocarbons out of production and then out of the atmosphere, many times deadlier as a greenhouse gas than CO2. We're going to stop all new leases on public lands for oil and gas, and existing leases are going to reflect the true cost of carbon and pollution. That will be priced in as we renegotiate these agreements. We'll ensure that every procurement and purchasing decision likewise reflects the cost to our environment. So as we build out, we've got $4 trillion in infrastructure needs. As we build that out, we're going to also look at the carbon cost of the materials that we use, the concrete, the cement, the steel, find a way to make those in a more environmentally sound way, and then in some cases use alternative materials. I mentioned farming, I mentioned the $5 trillion investment, but to your point about capping, it's the one sure thing that we can do if we are to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050, if we want to be halfway there by 2030, which is really only a decade away, then we don't have time to experiment, in my opinion, with different ways to get there. We have to set an absolute cap in every single sector of this economy, not just transportation, not just electricity generation, but everything. The only way that we're going to be able to make that is to do that. And so, yes, I believe that capping total emissions makes a ton of sense. I believe that using the regulatory and rule writing authority through the EPA to protect our water, our soil, and our air, we can begin on day one. And yes, I think we've got to make this case everywhere in the country because every part of this country has been affected by climate change so far. The constituency is there. We just have to connect what they're experiencing to what we want to do going forward. Thank you for asking the question. Appreciate it.
Hi, how are you? My name is Danica. I live right here in Salem. Welcome to our town.
Thank you.
You touched on healthcare briefly, and I work in healthcare. I'm a traveling hospice, LNA, and I specialize in Alzheimer's. And I'm wondering what you will do for Alzheimer's research and those currently living with Alzheimer's.
Thank you. Thanks for the question and for what you do. My sister Charlotte is a nurse and has worked as a hospice nurse. And I know from her how fulfilling that work is and just also how hard that work is. So thank you for doing that and for raising this. Look, the best case for investing in the cures to Alzheimer's is made by those family members who've lost a loved one, members of the Alzheimer's Association who came to my office every single year to make the case. And what they'd say is, look, this is everything that we're spending as a country to treat those with Alzheimer's now. This is the longevity of Americans' lives with Alzheimer's. So this is your cost over time, and it's just astronomical. And this is what it would be if we invested more upfront to find the cure by investing in the research and development necessary to come up with that. That argument finds a home with me. I'd much rather increase the amount that we're spending right now, get to those cures, both for those whom we love and care about, and we lost our grandmother to Alzheimer's and saw her go through that, but also if we're going to make sure that we manage the ability to be there for everybody and have the resources necessary to pay for universal, guaranteed, high-quality care. These investments up front make that over the long term possible to do. So I want to make sure that we do that. Thanks for asking the question. Appreciate it.
I'm Addie, and I was just curious on what your plan is for the first 100 days you're in office and how much progress you think you'll be able to make, since right now we're not making any forward progress.
Thank you, Addie. Yeah. So I mentioned a couple of things that I want to be able to do day one as it relates to climate. You know, getting back onto Paris, all those things that we just discussed. Within the first 100 days, introducing legislation that sets a defined cap on what we emit and gets us to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and the investment necessary to make that possible, which is a substantial amount, but it's the only way to do that. But your question points out there are a number of other pressing priorities. Those dreamers that I referred to, more than 1 million in this country, I want them contributing with all of their potential as U.S. citizens. I want to find those Republican colleagues with whom we can work, and they do exist, to bridge the divide, to get this done. And it's not enough to introduce a legislation for the next president to say, this is how it should be, but we've got to go campaign in those communities. We have to work this incessantly. This conversation must never be allowed to stop, or else this country is going to stop in the deadlock that you just described. Healthcare, if we're not well enough to live to our full potential, to go to school, to work a job, to carry our fair share of the burden so it rests a little bit lighter on everybody else, to write the poetry, to sketch this lake one summer evening, then we all lose out on the quality of life that those people who were not well enough to do those things would have provided. So making sure that that is introduced very near the beginning of our term, if not in the first 100 days. A plan called Medicare for America, which basically says for the tens of millions who have no care at all, they're enrolled in Medicare. Those who have insufficient care, they're insured, but they can't bridge the deductible or afford the premium or make the copay, they are able to move over to Medicare as well. But those who have employer-sponsored insurance, and they like it because it works for them and their families, are able to keep it. That's the surest, quickest path to get to universal, guaranteed, high-quality care. I mentioned the move that we need to make on gun legislation to save more lives in this country, universal background checks, removing the loopholes, stopping the sales of assault weapons and military-style weapons into our communities. All of that needs to happen right at the outset of this administration. And we've got to make sure that we're not just electing a person into the White House, and that we don't just focus on defeating Donald Trump. This really has to be part of a movement that can ensure that we can secure these victories well into the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth year of this administration. It's the only way we can get it done. I think we learned some lessons from the Barack Obama administration. He made a tremendous amount of progress. But if there was more of a coordinated movement and effort and ability to plug all of us in to the work that he was trying to do, I think he could have been even more successful. And that's an opportunity for us going forward. Thanks for the question.
Okay, right here.
Thanks, Ms. Connell.
Hi, Beto. My name is Oye Carr. This is my son, Ulysses. We have a problem with equity and fairness in this country. So I'm interested in how would you use the tax code to address these issues of fairness?
Yeah.
Good question.
One very obvious opportunity, but it will be insufficient. When we look at the fact that there's 10 times the wealth in white America today than there is in black America, and that families have been able to successfully pass on that wealth over time. In my case, though we weren't fantastically wealthy and I was taking out student loans every year I was in college, when I moved back to El Paso and wanted to start a business and couldn't get a loan in a bank, my dad took out a personal loan against the value of his home, $20,000. That allowed me to start this business, to hire people, to build a high-skill, high-tech, high-wage business in El Paso, Texas. We know from our history of redlining and excluding African Americans from the ability to build wealth through home purchases, that opportunity does not exist for much of the country. We also understand that the legacy of segregation and suppression is alive and well. I mentioned the 50th in the country voter turnout in Texas. that has impacts on the public policy that we pursue in that state. So what if in the tax code we did a better job of breaking down that accumulated wealth, of taxing it so that it is not producing the greatest income and wealth inequality that we've seen in our lifetimes, unseen since the last Gilded Age of the 19th century. What if we decided that we would use the proceeds to invest in people, in education, moving the first day of school for every child from kindergarten, where they're 4 or 5, to pre-K, where they are 3 or 4, doing a better job of hiring teachers who look like their students when we understand a disparity in discipline, where children of color are in that kindergarten classroom disciplined, suspended, expelled at 5 times the rate as white kids, beginning a schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline then at the most vulnerable age that has produced the largest prison population on the face of the planet, disproportionately comprised of people of color. And we understand the compounding effects of all of this. Once released from prison, forced to check a box on every employment application form, making it less likely that you're able to get that job and to build wealth and to have an income that can be taxed in the first place. So I see all of this connected and all of this rooted in the foundation of our country and the way that we built wealth originally. Kidnapping people in West Africa, transporting them here, building literally the success and wealth of this country with no prospect or hope of being able to share in that. That is alive and well in the United States of America right now. So yes, we can address it in the tax code to make sure that wealth is taxed, that we tax capital at the same rate that we tax ordinary income, that we invest those proceeds into people so that they can rise up as well. But when we see the disparities in education, in healthcare, where maternal mortality is 3 times as deadly for women of color, where we have a disparity in infant mortality between white and black America that's greater today than it was in 1850. It's every single part of society right now. But yes, we can do more in the tax code as we can in almost every other sector. Thanks for asking. Appreciate
All right,
it.
we're down the middle.
Ulysses, nice to meet you. Yeah.
Here we go, right here.
Yeah.
Hi, Beto. This is Creedy Stowe. I lived in Texas for 20 years and often ironically miss it. And so I've been following you for a while. So I'm not going to ask you about policy because I know a lot about what you've said and what you think. What I want to know is Donald Trump is, in my opinion, a really frightening and despicable human being. I have a 23-year-old son who plans to leave the country if he's reelected, as many young people that I know plan to. They will not live in a place that is continuing to go down the path we're on now. They've destroyed our federal judiciary. Our Senate is in shambles. It's absolutely mind-bending to me what's going on. He is a really difficult opponent for a nice guy. You are an ethical, decent, policy-driven, warm human person. And he's a pig. So that's being really, really hard on pigs. Okay, so what is your plan to just, I don't mean you have to punch him in the face, but something that gives people a sense that you're gonna punch back, that you're really gonna bring what needs to be brought to the fight. And I have to confess that those of us that used to be pacifists are kind of anxious to see, you know, a little blood sport from the Democrats at this point. Kind of done.
Thanks for the question. So whoever the nominee is, I hope that we're going to have an incredibly clear, stark choice in November of 2020. You have someone, as you said, who lies, who's violated every norm and standard of civility in this country, who seeks to undermine our institutions, the press, the enemy of the people, instead of the best defense against tyranny, mocking a justice of the federal bench because he's Mexican American, somehow unfit to render judgment on this president because of his ethnicity. Klansmen, white supremacists, Nazis, very fine people. Mexican immigrants, rapists, and criminals, asylum seekers, and infestation. Ilhan Omar, duly elected representative who happens to be a Muslim, conflated with the terrorists on 9/11, all from this president. So what he's doing, and this is the oldest trick in the book, is he's dividing us in order to conquer us, to make you angry, to keep us apart, and make us afraid. To stir that panic and that paranoia. And to some large degree, he's been very successful in that. When he came down to El Paso about 6 months ago, tried to use our community, which is 1/2 of the largest binational community in the Western Hemisphere, El Paso, one of, if not the safest cities in the United States, and it has been 20 years running, because, not despite the fact that we're a city of immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees, we, the people of El Paso, held a counter rally just a couple of blocks from where he was, and it was so profoundly beautiful. Where his rally was full of these hate-filled screeds and racism and calls to paranoia, where a reporter, a journalist, just like those who were set up here, was attacked after that crowd was stirred into a frenzy against them. You know, ours was this extraordinary display of the best of this country. A city that defines the immigrant experience, coming together, people from the planet over in one place outside, not against that guy, but for us and for the future of this country. And I so loved getting to be a part of that. And I thought really that's the answer to him, to your question. If we descend into that stuff, the name calling, the pettiness, the meanness, the attacks, and lose sight on what I'm hearing from people in every single one of these town halls about their desire to be well enough just to lead their lives or get a world-class public school education for their kids or confront climate before it's too late. One, I don't know that we'll win in November. Two, I don't know that we will have built the coalition or the movement, to the question earlier, to actually get this stuff done once we are in office. So I'm going to campaign much in the same way that you see me here, you know, on the truth and the facts, talking about what inspires me and excites me, boldly ambitious and aspirational, and calling upon all of us to bring our service and our sacrifice, our creativity to bear in order to accomplish our priorities. That's what's got me into this. That's why Amy and I decided to run. Would love to have your help and your support to do it. And I think that's the best way to beat Donald Trump going forward. Thanks for asking.
All right, we're in the back, straight down the middle. There we go.
There you go.
And we have time for 2 more questions.
All right, so first I just want to thank Jim and Janet for opening up your home to all of us. Thank you very much. I also don't have a policy question. I have more of an intellectual question. So part of, yeah, sure. So part of being president is also about building really good teams. And what do you think makes a good team, and how are you going to ensure that that happens?
Yeah. Wow, that's good. Listen, some of you were on our team at a distance when we ran against Ted Cruz in Texas. There were phone banks set up in New Hampshire, in Massachusetts, in California, and everywhere across this country. There were people who drove down to Texas to spend some time knocking on doors. What I found in 2017 and 2018 is that people wanted to make a contribution. They wanted to register, they wanted to make sure they voted, but they also wanted to work. They wanted the responsibility of connecting with the other voters who would make this decision. And in a campaign structure, to your question, that was decentralized and organized around the people in the 254 counties of Texas, say, hey, if you're up for it, we want you to take the lead, host these canvases out of your kitchen. We'll send you the source code, and then you just go with it. And people did. And so in their own words, not from a script, they were connecting with their neighbors, this incredibly transcendent act in this very digital, divided age where we're obsessed with our devices, to have this unscripted moment at someone's door. And to not be pre-programmed, but to say what's really on your mind, why you're knocking for Beto right now. And really you're not knocking for him, you're knocking for this country. And this is why this moment means so much to you. That's how we were able to do what was almost impossible in Texas. And again, though we didn't win, our state is forever changed. It's 38 electoral votes count now for the first time in my adult lifetime. We are in play, and we have a seat at the table, and people like you made that happen. So by bringing everyone in, not taking a dime from PACs or corporations or special interests, not looking at polls to find out what we believe or how we think or how I want to say something, and maybe that's clear for the better and for the worse sometimes when you listen to me. We're able to have these honest conversations with one another and ask everyone who's willing to step up and take on some of that responsibility. So our team, we're led by a terrific veteran of some historic campaigns, including the 2 successful Barack Obama campaigns. Jen O'Malley Dillon is our leader. She's now in El Paso, Texas, leading this team. A team that we are focused on ensuring looks like America, looks like every single part of this country, and a team that is focused on going to every part of this country and bringing everybody in. So we would love to have you on that team as well, but that's the organizing philosophy, is allow everybody to step up and take their part in this. Thanks for asking.
All right, we're behind you, Beto, and this is our last question.
Great.
Hello, my name is Iskaira, and this is Aya.
Hi, Aya.
And so I am an immigrant and a citizen, and I am married to a Jewish man. And the future scares me, with black churches, synagogues, and mosques being blown up, with the border being militarized rapidly. How do you, as a privileged white man, kind of lead the racial healing that we need and stem the rise of white supremacy?
Thank you. Very thoughtful question. And perhaps to add my own urgency to the conditions that you described, all those things that I just repeated that President Trump has said to describe our fellow Americans, our fellow human beings, they offend us. Perhaps they shock our sensibilities, but they also change how we act and how we treat one another as a country. You don't start putting kids in cages until you first successfully dehumanize them, at least to some who are putting the kids in cages, by calling them an infestation or describing them as animals. The mosque in Victoria, Texas, in my home state, was burned down on the same day that he signed an executive order attempting to ban all Muslim travel to the United States. Hate crimes in this country are up every single one of the last 3 years. But to the spirit of your question, many of these conditions preceded Donald Trump. He may be the latest worst manifestation of this. He may be calling out into public what has been happening privately for too long in this country, and it needs to stop. And much in the same way that I answered the question asked by Ulysses' father about how we address some of the basic inequity in this country. I want to make sure that we go to the very root and foundation of this problem, literally the foundation of our country and how it was created. But I can choose to do this as a white man, to involve myself in this conversation. I could just as easily choose to back out of it. Some cannot choose to do this. They live this every single day of their lives. When I mentioned that statistic earlier about the disparity in infant mortality, when they asked women of color about their experiences in the United States, and in some cases women who had immigrated from Africa, where they did not see these kinds of disparities, they talked about a weathering, endured day in and day out, of the way that they were treated, the way that they were looked at. Women who told me, even if I get health care, I'm treated differently in that clinic or hospital than a white woman is treated, which may begin to explain 3 times deadlier maternal mortality rate amongst women of color in this country right now. All I can tell you is I'm doing everything I can to listen to those who are experiencing this, to call it out as boldly and as plainly as I can, to follow the lead of people like Brian Stevenson in Montgomery, Alabama, who just helped to erect a memorial to truth and justice, so that we're not just celebrating civil rights victories in this country, but we're reminding ourselves of how we got here in the first place. The brutality, the lynchings, the legacy of that's still with us in our criminal justice system in every single part of our society. Beginning the work otherwise of repair that can lead to reparation and can ensure that we continue or we discontinue visiting these injustices on the generations that follow. So my commitment to you is to continue to do that, to acknowledge my privilege and the experience that is far different from others who are here right now. But my desire to make sure that we come together to be able to do this. It's the only way we'll be able to do this. No one group of people in this country can do it on their own. It's going to have to be those who see some kind of common cause to be able to do the common good. And so I'll give you everything I can to do that, and would love to be guided by you and led by you in the process. So thank you for asking the question. Really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Jim, Janet, thank you for having us here to your home.
It's gonna snow soon. It feels like
People of Salem, thank you for joining us today, for all the great questions and comments. We are grateful, and we look forward to seeing you back. We understand that it'll take 5 or 6 visits before you may make up your mind on some of these candidates. So we're going to continue to come back to try to see you. Thank you all very much. Very grateful.
And if you want to do photos, I think he's going to go inside the house, so kind of meander that way, and also